Well, good morning or good afternoon to you all and to our audience. My name is Eline Chivot and I'm Senior Policy Analyst at Center for Data Innovation, a think tank based in Brussels and in DC. And today I am speaking to you from Brussels. First of all, thank you for joining us to discuss today, will the EU data strategy prepare Europe to lead in the data economy? To set the scene first, just a little background information about the panel. It's clear that data-driven innovation will be essential to the EU's competitiveness. And to prepare for this future, the European Commission released a data strategy in February, which proposes to create a single market for data to facilitate government to business, and business to government data sharing, and to roll out tools to give users more control over their data. Now, the Commission has made clear that the EU's approach to data should follow a European way, but there are many questions lining up. For instance, the Commission has not yet specified what that will entail, what sector-specific data spaces might look like, what kind of regulatory intervention should there be, or how this approach will allow the EU to compete and trade with China and the United States. Now, feedback from the public consultation that recently ended will help inform a future EU legislative framework designed to overcome European challenges to realizing its potential in the data economy. Now, how are various stakeholders viewing these proposals, and how can we provide an assessment already as to whether the EU's data strategy is on track to strengthen EU competitiveness and innovation? I will first introduce our guests before we dive into the conversation, and as there may be some time for Q&As from our attendees, please do go to Slido as a participant, and you can join by using the hashtag CDI-EU-data-strategy to post your questions, and feel free to tweet as well using our handle and hashtag DataInnovation. With me today to discuss this great topic, and thank you all for making the time, we have Malte Beyer-Katzenberger, Team Leader for Data Policies in the Unit for Data Policy and Innovation at DG Connect at the European Commission. Andreas Hartel, Head of Division Strategy, Artificial Intelligence, Data Economy and Blockchain at the German Federal Ministry for Economic Affairs and Energy. We have Jessica Leonard, Senior Director, Global Data Privacy and AI Initiatives at Visa. Philip Malloch, Director, Economic and Social Policy at Facebook, and Teemu Roponen, General Manager of My Data Global, which is a global nonprofit with an ecosystem of multiple hubs working on the use of personal data. Thank you all for being there. I will start with you, Malte, for the Commission's perspective. What can you tell us about some of the preliminary results of the consultation on the data strategy and about the upcoming data governance framework, which is said to be about slim regulation? And perhaps how does that fit with existing EU laws impacting data?
No, thanks a lot, Eline, and everyone joining here on the panel. So it's a great pleasure. Thanks for inviting us. I think the positive tone set by the strategy is looking at a number of things. And the first thing is a second wave of digital data, which mainly comes from factories as they get connected to the Internet of Things. And that's not only factories, that's any object in commercial use will be connected at some point in time. That will create such a tremendous new wave of data that we have to really seize the opportunities that come out of that. And one of the things is that I think a lot of people looked at the personal data economy enabled by the Web 2.0. And they see now what went well and what went wrong. But also technology progressed. And I think the future of the data economy is decentralized. It's decentralized by design. And what do I mean by that? It's that the value capture can happen much closer to the source. We probably need a lot less concentration of data in one hand to make sense of it. But we also need probably governance mechanisms to interconnect the different players in a much more diversified data economy. So the term data governance is really at the heart of the strategy, and it means to encapsulate laws and regulations, contractual practices, and technologies. And part of this then by definition comes from the stakeholders as they see it fit. But one thing that comes also very clearly on the European side, at least of things, and I suppose in all the market economies, is that a lot of stakeholders now slowly realize the value of the data that they generate or contribute. And everyone understands now better than maybe 10 or 15 years ago that they should capture this value and at their own side. And that's then what people refer to as data sovereignty or digital sovereignty, that companies want to also hold some of this value. Now, should this lead to a withholding of value, that they don't share data anymore with anyone and don't give it to platforms of some sorts or to other partners? We don't think so, but rather we need now to construct a data governance that allows everyone to participate in this governance. And that's what the concept of data spaces is all about. So the data spaces are the concept where this should be organized. It's an organizing concept for data sharing, which should bring down the cost of data sharing. And that's what people really said should happen in the public online consultation that we ran this spring. So everyone agrees that this is a good idea, because also we say under the first act, we will look at voluntary sharing. We will look at data that everyone would in principle be willing to share if the costs of sharing were just lower. And this is a cost we want to drive down with the legislation on business-to-business situations, but also with individuals who want maybe to donate data for an altruistic purpose or participate, as in the My Data vision it is, with personal data stores or personal data spaces as active agents in the data economy. And this is really what people generally seem to like, that we need this much more decentralized way of organizing the data economy, and that allows then more value capture at more places. That's in a nutshell maybe how we see it. And for that reason, the forthcoming regulatory instrument will be indeed quite lean. It will not say who has rights to access what data or not, but it leaves it to the parties to decide. It will push the public sector a little bit more on the more confidential type of data they have in repositories like health databases or even financial supervisory databases, where you could say, well, with a little bit of technology or with a great deal of technology, you can actually do some analytics. And I should be really speaking carefully because I know journalists listening in. So some analytics is maybe possible. Not everything will go to the open, but pattern detections that don't expose any privacy of any company can possibly be possible. And pattern detection that don't expose individuals, the same thing. So technology on data analytics has now progressed to an extent that we don't have the dichotomy between let's open that database for everyone and for everything, or not open at all, but there's much more middle ground solutions possible. And all these things we want to address in the first piece of legislation that will come after the data strategy, probably this autumn still.
Thank you very much for these introductory comments. I have a follow-up questions, if I may. So I was wondering if there's any type of data space collaboration that the Commission is prioritizing. Like some data spaces, like the health and green data spaces, they have not been prioritized in the strategy itself, but are these some of those that are likely to acquire more momentum than others?
Well, it's clear that some data spaces are more in the public interest and some are more in the private interest. And that's one comment. And then there's a second comment on financial support. Now, we just saw the closing of the multi-annual financial framework, and that gives a certain sum of money to the European Commission to support also these activities over the next 5 years. I haven't seen the breakdown figures quite yet. What's the impact on the deal on the program that would support this, which is the Digital Europe program. And depending on the budgetary envelope, we can support stakeholders in the creation of these data spaces. But what is clear is that the health data space will be set up by the European Commission together with the stakeholders in the member states. That's probably the only one that will set up by law, so to say. The others will be supported in one way or another, but should be driven by the stakeholders around needs, use cases that actually make sense. So that's maybe also a very important top-level comment. We will not set up the data spaces. It's for the stakeholders to do so. And then the Green Deal data space is probably somewhere in the middle, where there is benefits also for industry and the circular economy, by the way, when it's about resource management. And we will see how to set that one up, whether it's going to be by legislation or in another form of, but all of them. So the list that you saw in the data strategy is by no means exclusive. It was the ones who were mature enough to be presented already in February. But colleagues throughout the House have been, I think, sparked by this idea of organizing data sharing in a much more standardized and organized fashion through this concept of data spaces. And then again, the data spaces will look different. There's no common template that you have to follow. You will organize the data space to the needs, the use cases, the stakeholders, also the economic power relationships in a data space that are present. But the stakeholders will need to drive this themselves and then do the drawing themselves.
Thank you very much, Malte. Turning to you, Andreas Haltol, for the German Federal Ministry of Economic Affairs. So there's also a part that member states have to play, and there's a lot that Malte said that you probably will want to react to. So I wanted to have your perspective on this project of the Commission. How can it support it? What are the challenges that you think should be addressed? And maybe I could ask your view on this data governance, this suggestion for a part of that should come from stakeholders. And when is government intervention necessary compared to private sector or stakeholders-led efforts? Over to you.
Aline, first of all, thank you very much for having me representing the German government. Now, that really is an excellent question, and it's certainly not easy to answer. So I think Malte already described very good the perspectives of different interests in data sharing and data governance. Now, I would see two major challenges to tackle. One is the low availability of data. And I think there are two main reasons from my analysis so far. One is the structure of incentives to share data. And what we see is that there is a lot of negative incentive when it comes to trust. So whoever has data owns data. So we hear many fears, especially from SME companies, to share data, and also, of course, from individuals. I mean, the privacy discussion is legendary in Europe and globally. So that would be the one aspect, low availability of data. And the other question, of course, is how can we deal with data that is in place, and how do we deal with data that has some restrictions? And I think these two major challenges directly lead to what we could do with a new European framework. So I think the legal insecurity in data use is one major aspect, but I think we have to see that there will be, as far as I understood, several legal acts coming up, and one of them very sooner will be on the data spaces. Now, what we see is that we think the European data strategy is very promising because it's a very comprehensive policy document showing diverse activities and initiatives which can be taken. And of course, there are already initiatives from the Juncker Commission, the Open Data and PSI Directive, which we are currently implementing on national level, and on EU level, there will be implementing acts also on high level, on high value data sets. So I think, just in brief, and I think we will have a much more detailed discussion, I think what's really key is that we think European, and that we will have European solutions and not national solutions. Now, when it comes to national situations, we are a federal system, but we think that it's really important to have single points of contact for stakeholders when it comes to reaching out to governments, to administrations, to regulators. And what I would also say, also with the, as you indicated, I'm also in charge of artificial intelligence. So we just commented the AI white paper. We have a large discussion on horizontal and vertical aspects. And I think that the data governance needs to have both. It has to reflect both horizontal issues and sector-specific issues. And I think the idea of having sector-specific data spaces is the right way to start, at least, and to elaborate different kinds of data governance approaches that fit the individual challenges of sectors best. And final remark, I think that Germany and France, with the GAIAX initiative, which will be a European initiative, is especially working on the question of interoperability, and that of course is also a major issue when it comes to data governance. So maybe that as a starter from me. Thank you.
Thank you. Very tasty starter. Thank you very much. I'd like to turn to Teemu Roponen from MyData, because the question also to you: what are the, what are your thoughts? What is it that in your work you're doing when it comes to those questions of data sharing? How do you see this data strategy and some of those challenges that Andreas referred to: low availability of data, interoperability, the fact that there's some data with some restrictions, legal security issues for data use. What is your view on that?
Sure. Thanks, Elina. Thanks, everybody, and thanks for inviting me. So my name is Teemu Roponen. I work as the general manager of MyData Global. I'm probably out of all of you least known, so maybe just a word about MyData Global, an international nonprofit headquartered here in Finland, but working globally for the individuals and with the purpose of giving individuals rights and the agency the tools to have more control over their personal data, and that of course is very central in the data strategy, and we are happy to be mentioned there. Three things that we see essential in the MyData thinking and MyData vision. I mean, first of all, getting those rights to be actionable, so meaning more real-time usage, a real-time control of the rights, making them one-click rights, which is not really yet there with the GDPR. Then secondly, the kind of shift from data protection to data empowerment, meaning that of course as individuals in our use cases, we'd like to combine data from various sources and make that data available in our life decisions or in our daily actions, whatever that might be. So the mindset set from just protecting to empowering. And then thirdly, from closed ecosystems to more open ecosystems where companies can collaborate and of course compete, also a more level playing field. And of course, these three fundamental shifts that were outlined in the MyData Declaration, the data strategy definitely has all of those in it. So of course we were happy to see that. Now, with regards to what's concretely happening, as an example, we talk about the data intermediaries or MyData operators, we call them in our language. Well, we just released a white paper on that a couple of months ago, and now several dozen companies were taking part in that from numerous countries worldwide, and now they are self-describing and working together on this road, taking the first steps toward the journey to interoperability. And we realize it will take some time for this interoperability to happen, but already companies are doing it. The MyData operators in the MyData ecosystem are doing it and taking those steps. So in that sense, we are very curious and excited about some of the EU and the Commission plans on this, and eager to see at what level is the regulation then, and what level do we see things later on down the line.
Thank you, Teemu. I will now turn to our two other guests, starting with you, Jessica, for Visa. I'd like to know, how did Visa welcome the EU data strategy? What were your thoughts on the overall vision, of course, and perhaps with an angle on, there's a lot of existing coordination with industry, with code of conducts and self-regulation frameworks. So the private sector is already creating shared sectoral data spaces. So I was wondering, to what extent is there a need for intervention? Can't data spaces be governed by industry-led self-regulation? What should we be mindful about when crafting going further with the data strategy? Thank you.
Okay, you might have to remind me about the end part of that question about halfway through. I think we really welcome the strategy. We, like everybody, all the stakeholders in this conversation, we want to see economic growth, we want to see innovation, we want to see those benefits from consumers, and we want to see those solutions to the big challenges. How do we deal with pandemics? How are we going to tackle climate change? So in that respect, having the EU lead on an ambitious data sharing framework is something we really like the sound of. But there does need to be alignment between industry and policy objectives, and between those existing frameworks and the plethora of existing regulation, and also with consumers. Because I think, to echo the comments just before me, this doesn't work without consumers. And this movement from data protection to data empowerment is something that really, that's music to my ears. It's very much the way that we think as a company. In terms of what we like about the strategy, and there's a lot, of course, there are things which would incentivize a company like us to get involved or potentially disincentivize. I think the most striking element to us here really, because we're big proponents of market-based solutions, is that this is a voluntary framework, but it's underpinned by a really clear vision and a direction of travel from policymakers, which is always welcome. Especially if you're a global investor like us and you're looking for that legal certainty in the markets that you invest in. So the voluntary nature of this in Europe makes it look like this is a good place for us to explore some opportunities. We're not in favor of regimes that mandate data sharing without a very good cause. And we think that there are actually really strong incentives in here for companies to want to do this. So, for example, we think about the potential to enhance our own data sets. That's really, really interesting to us. Potential participation in exchanges, there may be revenue opportunities associated there. We're thinking very hard about the not-for-profit activities that we do in data, and this could definitely potentially enhance our partnerships and the data activities we think about in that space. It looks to me as though with all of the activity here that might come around standards, around IP, that actually even in bilateral data sharing, you might actually come on leaps and bounds through this project. And then there's the consumer focus. So obviously here we're talking about non-PI data, right? But we do think that with the increased focus on sharing, that increase on privacy is going to happen commensurately, and that need to build trust too. So we think that there are potentially win-win opportunities here for consumers, but also for companies that want to be privacy champions. So companies that are thinking about opportunities to put consumers back in control of their data sharing. I talked about a few of the broader benefits. So, getting over some of those key legal and technical challenges, standard contract clauses, getting that legal clarity over IP, data quality, which is something we think about all the time. You mentioned interoperability. So there's plenty in here for us that we like. You mentioned, I think, how this might interact with already existing schemes. And of course, there is a lot of data sharing. I suspect that all of us are able to point to whether it's bilaterals, whether it's ecosystem, whether it's that we're involved in a project or an initiative or a scheme in one market. Yes, absolutely. This activity in the last few years has absolutely exploded, which is fantastic. But this does mean that whatever happens driven by policy in this sense, we're going to want that to be streamlined, and not just streamlined with the standards as they develop and with the industry initiatives that are coming through, and all those new amazing business models, data trusts and exchanges and collabs. This is all very positive. And making sure it works complementary to all of that is really important. But you also need to think about the existing regulation, because if there are proposals to bring through new regulation, then obviously you need to do that gap analysis so that you're not over-regulating or creating complexity or confusion. And this is a world in which we're talking about potentially sectors that are already heavily regulated, like ours. And of course, we have PSD2 as well. So we already have mandated data sharing in one sense in our sector. But you're also talking about now data protection and privacy as a fundamental right, and consumer protection, and the regulation that will come forward on AI, which we're also very excited about. So you have this smorgasbord of different regulation. So I think this is a real challenge for industry, standards bodies, and regulators to work together and make sure that this is all really in sync so that it achieves what everyone wants it to achieve.
Thank you very much, Jessica. That was great. And I didn't need to remind you about the second half of my mouthful question. Thank you. Turning to you, Phil, for Facebook, we're very curious to see how your thoughts complement those perhaps of Jessica from an industry perspective. I suppose you have some thoughts on how the data strategy you see it will incentivize data sharing and how it can empower consumers. So thanks for sharing your thoughts with us today.
Yeah, no problem. And thank you for having me. This is a hugely important topic from Facebook's perspective, and an initiative from the European Commission, which we've very much welcomed to put a discussion on the table. I think as the previous speaker pointed out, this is an intersection of many different considerations from a policymaker's perspective, whether it is those discussions on privacy and whether it's those discussions on data protection. We look at also the enormous economic possibilities that are out there as well. If Europe has the ability to move forward and develop a data economy further, and really push forward with a number of those areas. I think one of the points to echo as well, which I think is being picked up by a couple of speakers, but is incredibly important in this space, is also a determination that this is a European single market initiative. That this really focuses on how do you build a strong European single market towards the issues around data sharing and the ways in which the data strategy points to the specific data spaces and verticals. I think, again, this is the curse of being the last speaker because you just repeat what everyone else has said, I think. But we did pick up on the fact that this is ultimately about users and about people as well, and people feeling like they're empowered to move their data. People are empowered to understand their data, and there is an awful lot of industry collaboration underway at this point as well to try and make some of this a reality. Facebook is involved in, for example, a data transfer project with a number of companies that is looking about how can we actually create that interaction between different companies to allow users to move some of their data between different platforms, be that Facebook, Google, or the other companies involved there as well. So this is something which is already part of the kind of industry discourse in terms of how do you make this a reality and what is out there, because there is an awful lot of opportunity for different industries. I think there's a big role that could be played also in the data strategy going forward, and one which maybe hasn't been picked up on so far, which is also how do you, if we think of the likes of Visa and Facebook, we're companies that have an awful lot of resource at our disposal when it comes to discussions around empowering the business around data and these kind of things, but also how do we really focus on ensuring that those small and medium-sized enterprises who probably have maybe the most to gain from utilizing the value of what data is and what it can represent for a business in terms of growth opportunities and understandings. I think that's a huge role the Commission can play here in driving forward some of that business logic and understanding amongst a broader subset of businesses across the board. And then maybe just one final point, because I think we've covered a lot of ground here, is I think that when we look at the COVID-19 crisis, this has really exemplified how we can collaboratively use the power of data to really impact some of those big societal challenges we've got on the table right now. We've partnered with a number of different organizations to see how can we make data more available, how can we make data more understandable, and how can we utilize data in these types of areas. And I think what the COVID-19 crisis has really done for data sharing or data strategy types of questions is, I don't think it's fundamentally changed the questions, it's just sped them up and put them in stark relief really quickly for us. An example from a Facebook perspective is the way we've brought together a dashboard of a service called CrowdTangle, which is available now publicly in European countries, which allows people to look real time at what is going on in terms of the conversation around the COVID-19 crisis across the different Facebook platforms, Facebook and Instagram, and allows people that real time view on what the conversation is and how is it happening. So I think that's the really important parts for us now going forward. Of course, this is going to go, as the previous speakers have mentioned, hand in glove with the evolution of an AI strategy as well. How are they going to sync together? What's the relationship and interplay? And then, of course, the European Commission is working on a large piece of work around the Digital Services Act, where we see a lot of discussions tied in there as well around what, for example, would a gatekeeper ex ante regulatory framework look like, and these different types of things. So it's all going to have to play slightly interweaved and interlaced with each other, but it's really important that you drive from the overarching perspective of a strategy to ensure that there's clarity in the policy direction, to ensure that we get that correct interplay between the different policies that are on the table right now from the Commission's perspective. So I'll leave my introductory remarks there, and then we can maybe open for the questions.
Thank you. Yes, a lot to unpack here. If I go back to you, Malte, I think some of the things that we heard was, the importance of focusing on SMEs to make sure that they gain from that. Maybe there's some things you'd like to react on that level. Also, the need for clarity. For instance, I mentioned the existing industry-led schemes, and how will they be consolidated? I hear of an EU cloud rulebook that should be updated or developed in 2022. Sorry for all the introductory questions, but just maybe try to pick a couple of elements that you would like to react on, adding as well that, as Phil said, this is an EU single market perspective, and Andrea said it's also indeed an EU solution, not a national solution. Should these data spaces be EU data spaces as opposed to transatlantic or global? And if that's the idea, why? And how does the idea of data spaces intersect with the EU support for the global free flow of data?
I might start with the last part, Eileen. I mean, I think the EU was always committed to a global free flow. Obviously, the European Commission can only formulate an EU strategy, not a global strategy. That's for other fora to determine. And there's lots of work going on in Geneva, in particular, on getting also to multilateral free flow initiatives. That's largely complex, and it's not an easy discussion, as you know, in these international fora, because there's different interests of different continents, even, and major emerging economies who have also marking their positions in this discussion. So it's quite hard to see how this goes. There's also a multitude of international fora. We just had an OECD discussion where there's also work on enhanced access and use of data, and really invite everyone to read that really superbly drafted document that came out in last November by the OECD Secretariat, which may translate into a OECD Council recommendation on data sharing, and that the drafts that I've seen are really shaping up well. So I think there's a certain type of consensus that most of these issues are global. Any evolved economy faces these issues because it's digitization issues. But I think the digitization is not everywhere. And you mentioned the SMEs, and it's really a question how also to bring in the SMEs in terms of digitalization first, but also in terms of making themselves seize the opportunities of data sharing. The second comment on the SMEs is maybe that not all SMEs are created equal. I mean, they're quite different in size. Some are part of industrial ecosystems. Some are in the service industry. Some are using platforms for intermediation services. That's gives rise to particular questions. But the thing that what I studied most in the past years was especially also digitization around connected objects. And there's a lot of questions around there. Are you in a supplier situation? Are you maybe even the SME which has maybe the only solution on the market for a specific type of problem? Then you are in a very strong position. Are you a large player who's still on the short and on the stick because it's maybe present only in supplier situations? So it really depends. I think size is not the only thing that matters, but getting digitization to SMEs is a major challenge. And also that SMEs then can easily start up to work on digital data, because this is maybe a resource which is relatively inexpensive to use, but if it's expensive or even impossible to acquire, it can be a problem. And one figure that surprised me, I mean, we did recurring questions in our past consultations as well. Are you having difficulties to access data that you would wish to like to access? And in the most recent consultation, it was 80% of those who answered the question who said, well, we faced access problems. So it's I'm not saying all the access problems are bad, because they were caused by legitimate refusals or an illicit or illegitimate behavior on the other side, but many people seem to try to access data and still can't get there. So there's a seems to be still some flow problem, and with the data spaces legislation, we want to actually push, and that's also in the OECD report, by the way, novel forms of intermediaries. And Teemu spoke about the My Data operators. I'm following this discussion for now 5 years, and I find this very promising. And I think we need probably similar data platforms also in industry, where we have more a facilitator role in the data economy than a full service conglomerate situation in the ecosystem, so that we can really have a much more divided situation of labor. Maybe a last point is obviously coordination, and coordination is really, really tricky. And maybe as we diversify also the discussion on the data economy into more substrands, there will be less of a coordination need, well, a perceived need to coordinate, because we understand that different things may all have something to do with data, but actually are different types of conversations. And so I think the platform conversation is one, and the Digital Services Act, the cloud conversation is a bit of a different one that reacts to different things. And the type of conversation that we try to foster is to increase flows and collaboration around data, and also the secondary use, so that we try to get to a data economy where more and more secondary, tertiary uses are actually possible. But that indeed has then again legal clarity questions with other legal frameworks, competition law and data protection. And here, I don't know, I mean, there are no easy answers, neither on competition law and on data privacy. What we have to bring down probably is the compliance costs. And that is not just a matter of time, that jurisprudence will tell you at some point in time what was legal and what was not legal, because this is maybe not the way to go for. And then also technology will be able there also to solve. And that's why we put so much maybe emphasis on these intermediaries and the technology that they could provide in terms of allowing traceability of data use in ecosystem, allowing actually basically monitoring also, and maybe even then on the basis of mutually agreed sanctions to also penalize certain actors who don't behave in an ecosystem. But I think a lot of the things are also in the technology, also then not only just penalizing technology, but also enabling technology in the sense that you can have data analytics done differently. And there's lots of solutions coming to the market in differential privacy. We mentioned them. And that these would be also rolled out and brought closer to the participants as a standardized service offers. And I mean, IBM has Truata. There's lots of different good initiatives, I think, coming up here as novel types of data analytics as a service in a privacy compliant manner. So I think we're going really well. But I think the undertone is still we want to empower everyone who's participating in the data economy to also be able to take the benefits. And that's really, I think, an empowerment, and that will bring competition, and that should then also bring innovation. And I think these three steps are very, very important.
Thank you, Malte. Turning to you, Andreas, although I could ask also Malte these questions, but Andreas, you referred to GAIAX. So the European Cloud Federation's design and architecture are still being discussed, and GAIAX would be a part of it. Now, there's a bit of skepticism, let's say, on how this would play out. On the most important cloud providers in the EU, you have Amazon, Microsoft, Google, IBM, Salesforce, and the only European challengers are OVH, Orange, and Deutsche Telekom. And Renault even chose to start working with Google Cloud recently. So how do you plan, because Germany and then later France were at were spearheading the project, how do you plan to convince stakeholders to give thrust to that project? Is there a potential also for GAIAX to go global? Because then that would be interesting to help EU companies that have activities beyond the EU market or are planning to expand. So please, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Now, I think the basic idea behind GAIAX is to create a secure and trustworthy data infrastructure network. And with this, to foster an ecosystem of trust. Now, what we see with GAIAX is, not from a static perspective. We want to see it in a dynamic way. Now, we don't want to compete to create a competitor for existing business models. We want to go we want to, reach out to the new evolutionary step. And we think that will be a network, that will be an ecosystem, combining storage capacities with analytical capacities. Now, what we are specifically doing, and with respect to the debate you refer to, now, already today there are 300 companies and organizations involved and in a way investing in GAIAX. And it's not only European companies, it's companies from many continents, and American tech companies are among them. And we think that has been a very productive approach, because we want to have a market player that is competitive. And this is why maybe if the idea was created in the political arena, the products, the governance framework of GAIAX will be industry driven. The idea is just that, we want to write the rules for future data infrastructures. And that, of course, will be maybe something that will show the way also as a best practice for other continents, or for a globally acting companies. We would be happy if that would be something that many companies align to. And I think we even if Germany or Europe is not the spearhead in digital companies, I think Europe really has set some really good best practices in regulation, not only the GDPR, that, by the way, is not only aiming at protecting personal data, but also to enable the free flow of personal data. Then, of course, I think Malte already mentioned that the free flow of data, of non-personal data regulation, that led to a commitment by the G20 in the previous year with the free flow of data with trust initiative that came directly from the Japanese Prime Minister Abe. Now, I think that Europe has shown, together with other partners, global partners, that we want to have a multilateral system of data flows and multilaterally developed rules for that. So yeah, maybe that is an answer to your very complex question.
Thank you very much. So we do have about 15-20 minutes left. I would like to ask the reaction of Jessica first, because you've heard a lot from Malte and from Andreas. So I'm sure you'd like to get back to a couple of points that were raised.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to unpick in there. I mean, maybe I'll talk about GAIAX and the idea of these kind of cloud-based federated data spaces first, because this is something that's definitely very exciting. And, I think when we read the strategy, it was quite clear, and it's nice to hear it reiterated, that the EU has a very natural and understandable drive for international competitiveness and innovation in data, but they are not foreclosing participation from other players around the world who might bring global expertise or resource or ideas into that environment. And I think that's really positive. I think we're all striving for best practice. We're all striving for innovation. So that's great to see. In terms of GAIAX specifically, it's very exciting. We're interested in exploring the concept. We may give you a call about that. We're talking to the ISDA about it at the moment. So that's extremely interesting. I think one of the terms that was mentioned earlier was digital sovereignty. And this is something which we think about a lot, because we're a global business that operates in 200 different countries. So we have this very helicopter view, as I'm sure Phil does, of regulation and the geopolitics that sits behind the way that different countries regulate in an area like data. And so I think whilst you can absolutely see how digital sovereignty can be about that international competition that I just talked about, and that desire to build brilliant infrastructure and brilliant architectures, and to do it in your region for the advantage of your region, I think that you also want to keep in mind that regulatory divergence, or indeed any initiative which leads to data localization, can be hugely, hugely detrimental to that free flow of data that you mentioned earlier. And I don't think that digital sovereignty needs to mean erecting borders to that flow of data. I think that global participation in global data flows have hugely positive outcomes. And data localization, I think it harms economies, and I think it harms the citizens that you're actually trying to serve. So I think there's a very interesting point here which sits above everything, which is how do you reconcile a regional approach with a global approach? It's the same problem that we've been dealing with for a long time with how do you reconcile a domestic approach with a regional approach. And GDPR is a brilliant example of that. GDPR, although it was created in Europe, has managed to drive up standards throughout the rest of the world. And that's incredibly positive. And for a company like ours that operates globally, that gave us a global gold standard to operate against. So one would hope that you'd see a similar thing happen here with data sharing. I think the emphasis that the Commission has placed on fundamental rights it really chimed with us very much as a business. We're a global heritage brand, we're a global corporate citizen, and we want to be a consumer privacy champion. So the Commission's intent, not just to advocate against data localization, but also to drive up those standards of consumer protection and be a champion of that, is something that, that should sit at the heart of any use of data, and particularly when you look at something like data sharing.
Thank you so much. I think I'll get back to that for a question with Teemu in a minute. But first, I wanted to ask Phil if you had any reactions to what you've heard before.
Yeah, sure. A couple of reactions probably. I think this point on data sovereignty, I think I can't add much to the explanation before, because I think it was absolutely spot on. But you look at the issue around data sovereignty, and it really is about how can you build an attractive as possible environment in Europe to encourage people to be part of a European data economy. So really trying to build up the capabilities and the attractiveness of Europe as a location, then this idea of sovereignty, of an empowered Europe, becomes probably the more attractive version of what data sovereignty is and could be about. So I think that's incredibly important in how we look at this. I still think that there is some fundamental questions when we look at the areas around data sharing, for example. I mean, this is something which we've published a white paper on a few last year or earlier this year, I'm not exactly sure. But I mean, there is some big principles we need to evaluate when we look at how we move into these areas in terms of the data we're talking about. I think as pointed to when we talk about the difference between personal data, non-personal data. There's also a lot of process involved in the middle in terms of who is the facilitator, the regulatory system, if there is one to be there. But this is of course something that we need to look at, and then also how do you ensure that the user feels that this is happening in a privacy protected manner. So as we continue to envisage an evolution down this path, it's making sure it's rooted in some of those really kind of clear and fundamental questions as we go forward. And then also, I think, some of the questions we were discussing before this event in terms of quality of data, and then also how that data is used, for example, in an AI way. I mean, just two examples from Facebook, which I think are useful to indicate this point. We just completed something which we've referred as the Deepfake Detection Challenge, which was an open challenge for people to design ways in which to detect deepfake videos, for example. A challenge consisting of more than 100,000 videos, enabling experts around the world to work on this sort of a challenge. So how do we engage people to kind of improve the experience that we're having across different areas of the digital experience? And then also designing things, for example, in Facebook, like Fairness Flow, for example, which is a technical toolkit for detecting the kinds of statistical biases that sometimes exist in data as well, So really, how do we work on building some of that technology, some of those principles, some of those ideals, and making sure that the way in which we evolve data and then AI in collaboration with that is done so in a way in which we feel is A, privacy protective from a user perspective, but then also be a useful way of ensuring that this evolution has taken place and has happened. So, I mean, one of the things which, you know, from my personal perspective, that I think is an exciting part of what we're looking at here is how we can really leverage the use of much more understanding of data when we look at things like the UN Sustainable Development Goals, for example. If we look at some of those really pressing issues from a global context that isn't, you know, of course, the COVID-19 crisis is front and center for us, but there is also still an enormous amount of different challenges which I think can hugely be enhanced by the way in which we utilize data and the way in which we try and collaborate, especially between companies and the research community as well, to bring us forward a bit more in our understanding of how to engage in some of those real big societal questions. So yeah, I'd say that's just a couple of reflections that we have now.
Thanks very much, Phil. I just wanted to circle back to what Jessica said on, you know, we talked about data empowerment, and Jessica referred a few times to the importance of consumer protection, and Teemu, so did you as well, and you mentioned the control of data. It's important for individuals. Now, you also referred to some limitations of the GDPR. As much as we hear that it is there, you know, and that it is in many ways the standards to which a lot of our companies uphold, you know, what are these insufficiencies that you identify? I'm not sure whether I'm. In my view, it would be maybe the difficulty of perhaps having duplication of rules, and maybe the fact that there is a need to increase data sharing, but in some ways, you know, the GDPR limits how much data you can collect. There are some transaction costs. So I was just wondering, what is your perspective on the limitations of GDPR?
Sure, thanks. Thanks for the question. Probably a number of things that can and should be fixed. Fundamental to the my data thinking, combining data from different sources for different use cases. For example, you'll understand that the having real-time APIs to get your personal data would be among the important things. There is no such requirement right now. The data portability in general, lacking maybe some clarification and some governance structures there, standards perhaps, and then getting also some of the public sector data available. So like imagine combining your data from different sources to create a certified CV for job seeking, for example. You can understand that these types of use cases, you are bringing data from multiple types of places, multiple public and private sector and so on. And the GDPR doesn't quite have all the stuff there. It's great. It's a great building block. And like Andreas said, many countries are taking suite of that, but still making that a bit more human-centric, a bit more real-time. That would be our ask.
Thank you so much. I have a couple of questions also from participants that we'd like to ask before a last round of closing question to all of you. We'd like to ask Malte. So a lot of problems related to AI systems inaccuracy and inefficiency could be addressed with a bigger focus on data quality. I think Phil referred to that earlier, and it's quite underrepresented in the data strategy, according to some feedback and compared to other conversations. So we're focusing a lot on interoperability and data standards, and perhaps less on, you know, reviewing the data, more funding for data quality. How is the Commission planning to address this issue?
I mean, there's maybe two issues. There's data quality, which is a business problem in terms of it takes time and effort and money to clean the data to make it fit for purpose. And there's a policy problem where actually using, so to say, unclean data leads to undesirable policy outcomes. Now, data quality is fitness for the intended purpose. So it's a purpose or context-dependent concept. So any data can be of good quality or bad quality at the same time. It just depends on what you want to use it for. And that makes it so difficult, from my perspective, but maybe I'm missing part of the conversation, to really go say, we'll have now an intervention here and we mandate or we improve data quality. I mean, pouring money into improvements is one option, but it's going to be spraying into the open. So it's really hard. What I think, well, from the internal conversations, what we were thinking is to prevent or to make it easier for developers and data curators to signal potential bias risks that are so obvious that they can be signaled for a wide range of potential use purposes. So if you get to a situation where a data curator can already, well, assume a number of use cases, well, you can maybe nudge or even incentivize that group of people to say, signal this, please. But beyond that, I think it's really hard to work on data quality from a public sector side. This is really a business problem that business needs to solve. But that then brings also the question, I mean, if companies are willing to pay for good quality, cleaned data that are curated, that would become a paying service, and intermediaries could emerge, or the data source makes relevant efforts. But we've discussed this. I mean, we had great discussions. Some know the data sheets for data assets project. We had great discussions with Hannah Wallach from Microsoft. Getting the teams to do proper documentation is a huge challenge. It's like in software documentation. Why would you invest in documentation when you are actually interested in doing the coding? And that's for me the huge challenge. I think there's no really clean public solution. It's more a private solution that is necessary.
Thank you very much. Just being mindful of time, I wanted to ask each of you to perhaps close by coming back to some of the points you've heard and you wanted to react on and you thought it was important to insist or circle back to. And if you want to as well, please share what you think should be the first step for EU data policy moving forward to work really as an incentive and a successful project. What should be the priority based on, you know, your own perspective? For instance, what industry, what European firms, what intermediaries, what do they expect and what would truly benefit them? Let me start with you, Teemu.
Thanks. That came a bit fast, but let's make the data flow real time. Really look forward to. I know that there are some consultations going on, even if it's holiday time here in Finland that Malte and others are doing. Look forward to hearing the answers to those. How the infrastructure will be or how the operators might be governed.
Thank you, Andreas. Did you want to conclude with some comments?
Yes, thanks. Maybe quickly, I think we need more education on data. So one of the huge obstacles for AI companies when they go to an SME company trying to sell a product is what we just discussed with Malte's answer, the data quality. So I think it's really crucial from a business perspective to make clear to companies that, you know, an AI project is just not another IT project. It's totally different, and it depends on the quality of data that an AI company finds there. So education on data would be very helpful, and especially when it comes to administrations. I mean, I'm representing a government and administration, and I think what really could serve as a best practice, even if the UK has unfortunately left the European Union, but it's to have something like an Open Data Institute. I just visited Jenny Tennyson in London at the end of February, and I think that we can really learn a lot from the approach taken by the UK. And we are thinking in Germany, currently drafting a national data strategy, if that could be one of the major steps to simply give support to people working for administrations to improve the data quality and the availability of the data of administrations.
Thank you very much, Andreas Hartl, for being with us today. Phil, would you like to come up with your own conclusions?
Yeah, sure. Just a wholehearted support of Andreas's points around really investing in that education piece and really being able to build some of the skills and empowerment necessary as a result of that. I think for me, it's about how Malte and his colleagues in the Commission are able to really drive the single market nature of this. So in terms of prioritization, really is making sure that at the European level, member states, and it's good to hear our friends from Germany thinking in this mindset, is really making sure that this has a broad buy-in from a single market perspective. But then also, I mean, just finally, I think it's really looking at where users find value and really investing in those areas and understanding where's value created and what are those products and services that consumers across Europe really find are the ones they really want to be using and what adds value to their everyday life. So I'd probably put those points as the ones where to focus at the beginning.
Thank you very much, Phil. And Jessica, final word is for you. I had so many more questions, but
we'll do another event. So I think there's just two things. I mean, first of all, thank you so much to everybody, because it's been fantastic to be a part of this conversation and to hear so many shared views and, you know, shared views on the challenges as well as the solutions, which is always useful. There's two things that I just think I'll finish on. So you asked in the short term, you know, what do we need to get cracking on? There's a legislative timetable, obviously, behind all of this, and an ambitious timetable to deliver a lot of these initiatives as well. So I think continuing this industry, government, policymaker conversation in the short term is really critical, because these things are going to happen fast, and we need to keep the conversation going and we need to keep it open. Particularly, I think, you know, I have in mind that there's been a really positive, I think, increasing sense from industry and regulators that very prescriptive ex-ante regulation is a poor fit in a lot of contexts when it comes to technology, and that actually what you want is this agile, flexible, more co-creative sort of regulation. So I think in the short term, working out how, as we move towards that new legislation, that's what we end up with, I think would be really positive. And then I'll just finish on, I think consumer empowerment seems to have been one of the really big themes of the day, and I think that's great. We've touched on education and skills, which I think is unbelievably important. You know, we're not there yet on that literacy piece. But I just want to touch on something that was in the consultation, in the strategy, which I thought was really interesting, which is this idea that although consumers may have rights, they don't currently have, in some cases, the tools that they need to exercise those rights. I think that's very interesting. We conducted a very large global consumer attitudes survey exercise in 2019, doing focus groups and various other survey activities. And one of the things that consumers told us very clearly was that their comfort with data sharing increases hugely when they feel that they have been given opportunity to adequately consent and feel that they have that control. It really was a huge, jumping of the curve in terms of how they felt about sharing data. So when we talk about tools that might enable consumers to better exercise their rights and empower them, we think something like consent management is potentially really interesting to investigate.
Thank you for bringing up Visa's research on that. I'm sure you managed to I hope you all managed to send your message to each other today during the conversation. Thank you so much for bearing with me a few extra minutes, and thank you to all of you and our audience for joining us today and for this intense discussion. The video of the event and the recap will be soon available, and as for me, I will see you again after the summer to discuss all the many and interesting pieces of legislation that are on the table. So the data strategy, the Data Governance Act, the DSA, the AI legal framework, and many more. Thank you for following us. Thank you for your time today, and have a great rest of the day and summer. Thank you.